Well, King David was one of those heroes. He was a great king. And what's the great story, hero of the faith, that we remember about David? Goliath, yes. As a young boy, he went out and faced a giant, Goliath, and everyone else was afraid to fight him and to go near him. And here was this young boy, and he went out with no armor, just a slingshot, and he knew that his God would take care of him. And so David became one of the greatest kings in the history of Israel. In fact, one of the titles of Jesus is what? The Son of David. David, a great king in the history of Israel. Yet, we find in today's reading that he had some pretty serious issues. Number one, he had an affair with Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. He should have been off to war, but instead he stayed around the capital city and apparently had too much time on his hands. While looking out over his palace balcony one night, he sees Bathsheba bathing on the rooftop, and lust overcomes him, and he has an affair with her. An affair that resulted in a baby. So in order to fix the problem, he plans for a major cover-up. And so what he does is he brings Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, home from the war front, supposedly to ask him to get a report on how things are going at battle. And so they have their little chit-chat, they talk things over, and then he sends him home, hopefully so that he will sleep with his wife. And then when the baby comes, think it's his, Uriah's, rather than David's. You see, back then they didn't have DNA testing back then, so maybe he could have got away with this. But the plan didn't work. Uriah was such a faithful warrior. He said, no way am I going to sleep with my wife when my comrades are out there on the battlefield right now. And so that plan failed, and so he had to move to plan B, which was essentially to murder Uriah and make it look like an accident. So he sends a letter to his commander. Guess who delivered the letter? Uriah himself. He is the deliverer of this letter, which tells the commander, basically, find a way to kill Uriah. Can you imagine that? You know, we have, I don't know how many of you know, we have rabbits that are meat rabbits that, you kill for meat. And you realize how difficult it is for a rabbit that trusts you and walks up to you and wants to be petted, how hard it is to try to harvest that rabbit, to kill it, when it's so trusting of you. And you think about that, that's what David did. There was this Uriah who worshiped the ground that he was on and trusted him. And here David stabs him, not literally, but figuratively, stabs him in the back. And Uriah actually carries the letter to the commander that tells the commander to put Uriah in a vulnerable position and then call the troops back. And once they called back, then Uriah was killed. And even though it was in battle, essentially the way it was orchestrated by David, this was a murder that he had committed. And so after Uriah dies in battle, then he takes Bathsheba to be one of his many wives. So now the prophet Nathan was given the task by God to confront David on this issue. So have you ever had to be the bearer of bad news? Well, that's what Nathan had to do. And that's where our reading actually picks up today. And Nathan uses a clever parable in order to drive the point home. Let's look at that parable. And the Lord sent Nathan to David. He said, he came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsels and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But instead he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity." Nathan said to David, "You are the man." You know, David must have really got caught up in this parable. I don't know whether he thought it was true or whether he knew it to be a parable, but he got angry. You know, like this person in this parable, how could he do such a thing? And he proclaimed a verdict against that person. And then Nathan holds the mirror up. "David, you are that person. You are the one who had multiple wives, but you took the one and only wife of Uriah and murdered him in the process. David, look what you have done." And David was sorry. This is an amazing story, and it might be, hopefully it's hard for us to relate to this. I'm not sure, hopefully everyone hasn't gone out and committed adultery and committed murder in the cover-up. It might be a little hard to relate to that, but I think there are some things that we can pull out of this story today that we can apply to our lives. And the first thing I would like to look at is the idea of accountability. Because sometimes we are like David. We are entrenched in our sins, and we do not even see that we are doing them. And just as we sang in this song about opening our eyes, God must open our eyes so that we can see what we are truly doing. You know, we look at David and we think, how could he? You know, literally, he should know sleeping with someone else's wife is bad, and then to try to cover it up is even worse, the murder that followed. But what David did is not any different than what we do today. We rationalize sin. We somehow in our minds talk ourselves into believing that what we did or what we are thinking about doing isn't all that bad. And just as God used Nathan to help David see his rationalization, that really is our job here as a community as we walk together in faith, that we need to do to open the eyes of the people around us who rationalize sin. There is a scriptural command that we are to hold each other accountable. But you know what? That's becoming increasingly difficult in our world today. Why? Because if someone Christian goes to another person, another Christian, and confronts them to their sin, what do they shout out? You're being judgmental. Those judgmental Christians. In fact, there are many books out there. People don't go to church today because they view Christians as being too judgmental. In fact, we have an upcoming Lifetree Cafe session coming up, and it's called Temptation. And this is a story about a pastor who, like David, committed a serious sin, but he's very upset with the church because the church was harsh and judgmental with him. In fact, I believe he actually refers to the fact that unbelievers were more kind to him than believers. And so he comes down hard on the church for the way they handled his sin. And the video, I believe, actually is produced in a way which seems to show some sympathy toward his cause. So in typical Lifetree fashion, this question will be brought to you, and you'll get to discuss, well, is he justified in his rebuke of the church? Was the church wrong in treating him the way that he was treated? So I'll ask the question this morning, will this reading today help us in this discussion? And I think so, because this reading reinforces the idea of accountability. This idea that we as fellow believers are to hold each other accountable, to hold that mirror up to each other, to expose the rationalizations that we are using to justify our sin. Now, I do have to say there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. And as Christians, we often get it wrong. We put ourselves on a high pedestal. We look down our noses in a condescending way. We put down Christians for their sins. But the gospel says that we are to take the log out of our eye before we take the speck out of another person's eye. It doesn't say that we can't take the speck out of the eye, out of the other person's eye. It just says that we need to examine ourselves first to come to that person in humility with really an intent of helping that person, not to put them down or degrade them, but to help them who are living in sin. So I do think